Welcome to the Convergence podcast. The Convergence is a space designed for university students, college students, and young adults to explore and deepen their faith. It's a space to think, question, doubt, and hopefully, ultimately, to worship. So glad you're here. So we had such a rich conversation on October 20th at our Convergent Conversations where we together talked about a spirituality of being alone. It was a beautiful time. So this is a recording from that event. On November 3rd is our next Convergence at Brentview Baptist Church, and we'll talk about a spirituality of study. Here is Convergent Conversations from October 20th.
So, little summary from last time. Do you want to quickly go over it for those of us maybe who weren't in the room?
Yeah, we can hit just a few key themes. So first of all, our last talk was a follow-up to the previous talk. So the last time we talked about a spirituality of being alone, and then that was a follow-up of a spirituality of being together. And I guess maybe to go to the first one, we drew a lot from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was this German scholar, actually fascinating guy. There's a book called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, which is super fascinating because Bonhoeffer lived, I'm totally digressing here, but anyway, Bonhoeffer lived and was a minister and a theologian during the time in Nazi Germany. And actually, he was quite transformed when he moved to, I think, Harlem, and then came back. And so he was a resistor of the Nazi regime and of Hitler. Ultimately, got him killed. And so he's just a prolific theologian and thinker. And he has this one book called Life Together. And in Life Together, he makes kind of these two provocative statements, right? Where the one is like, let the person who can't be alone be aware of community. And then he makes the opposite point, like let the person who can't be in community be aware of being alone. And so he links these two types of being together in community and being alone. As important. And so one of the things that we talked about last time was maybe a few kind of highlights. One is that I think one of the things that keeps us from thinking well in this area has to do with us immediately going in our heads to introversion and extroversion. We think, and I had a number of people say that in various forms. Oh, well, that's going to be really hard for the extroverts, or the introverts will totally get this. And I'm like, not so sure. Because the solitude that we're talking about is a specific type of being alone. And in fact, one of the things that we talked about is that at the very beginning of Scripture, we do have, after creation, where it says that God pronounces that it was not good for the first human to be alone. And this is because it was a perpetual kind of aloneness that kept the human from experiencing true community, the type of community that they needed. And I'm referring, by the way, in that way, because the first person's not referred to as a man in Hebrew, until the creation of woman, by the way. So we always talk about like Adam as if Adam the man was there. Well, actually, Adam became a man at the creation of woman. And so you have this kind of fascinating thing happening. So there is the not good of aloneness, which we talked about as even solitary confinement in our prison systems, which is almost a form of torture for people. But on the way in tonight, I was listening to Bob Ekblad talk about this word withdraw that happens over and over again. And this is the positive kind of solitude that Jesus practiced. And so the type of solitude we're talking about is not the solitude that produces loneliness, but the solitude from which we withdraw and we're actually fed. And so this is why categories, I think, of introversion, extroversion become difficult, is because it's possible to be alone and have a non-productive alone time. So in other words, you're scrolling on Reels or whatever, and then like 45 minutes passes and you're like, what have I just done? Like, how much time just passed? And right? Is that solitude? Is that like a being alone that feeds your soul? Maybe not. So you could be an introvert who likes being away from people, but not actually experience a solitude that feeds your soul. In the same way, you could be an extrovert and like being with people, and yet experience a way of being with people that feels very lonely, right? And I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you're with a group of people and yet you feel like they're laughing, they're having an amazing time, and you feel like, why do I feel so distant from everything going on? So have you experienced community? Probably not, really. And so I talked about the move away from those categories into the category which I think influences time. And so then we talked about the idea of flow, drew a lot from Andy Crouch here. And Andy Crouch talks about this idea of flow. And he talks about how we enter things and exit things and how we experience time. So you can enter a thing with great difficulty. Think about running, and maybe people here love to run or love, some kind of cardio sport or whatever it is. That it's actually, there's resistance at the front end of doing that. Writing, all kinds of productive, creative things. Maybe reading, right? And it's like, for some reason, there's always resistance of like actually picking up the book and reading it, or of writing the paper, or of doing these things. And yet, once you get going, you experience a kind of flow, which you leave that feeling great. On the other hand, there are other things which we enter into with almost no effort whatsoever. Scrolling through Reels, or searching through Netflix, or being on the computer, and like just this endless stuff that you can do for hours. So you enter it with ease, but you leave it feeling almost ashamed and feeling depleted of energy because you've not experienced something life-giving, and somehow it's actually taking you almost out of this world into this like weird, almost alternate universe where you're like, what even just happened for the past 2 hours, right? Like, have you ever experienced that? You've been just like flipping through whatever, and you're like, what just happened, literally? And so the final thing that I'll say is then we talked about this idea of asking the question, why is it we resist solitude, right? Why is it the thing that actually feeds us becomes so difficult? And talked about the way in which Henry Nouwen, he says, first of all, we have a fear of the empty space. And the reason that we have a fear of the empty space is because it's linked to identity. We're so used to identifying ourselves by what we do, right? And so I've worked with musicians for 2 decades. And for some of these people, if you take their instrument away from them, they have no clue who they are. And this is true for a lot of us. I am what I do, or I am what I have, or I am what people say about me. And this can be true of people like building businesses, and it's like, oh, they're a good entrepreneur, they're a good this. Even in spiritual terms, actually. Oh, they're so holy. Oh, what a prayer warrior. And then we begin to take identity in these things. Another 2 categories Nouwen uses is I am my greatest failure, And then a more shocking one, I am my greatest success. He says, all of these are terrible ways of defining ourselves. But we're afraid of the empty space because we don't know who we are when we're not doing something. And so he talked about that, but he said maybe there's a second thing. Maybe actually we're afraid of the empty space because we're actually afraid God might say something to us. And maybe God will lead us in a place that we don't want to go. Now, the place that we don't want to go is a place which is always beautiful and wonderful, but like the things that bring us life, there's resistance at the front end. But if we can enter these productive spaces of solitude, somewhere in our soul we sense God speaking our true identity, which is not based on what we do, but it's our baptismal identity, where Jesus, or where the Father says, "You are my beloved." The same thing the Father said over Jesus at his baptism. And when God speaks that to us, then we can come together, and we're not trying to get from each other what we're only supposed to get from God. And because when that happens, then this whole thing right here, this is fraught with all kinds of potential for division, for frustration with each other, for being overbearing with each other, because we're like, oh, when I'm with you, like we're trying to get that thing from God from each other. So those were really, it's probably too lengthy, but that's kind of a summary of the last talk.
And this kind of makes me think of, I think it was Marva J. Dawn who wrote a book called A Royal Waste of Time.
Yeah, a great book.
And I haven't read the full book, but essentially she refers to this idea of a royal meaning, we're spending time in worship and prayer, which is an action directed towards God. But that on the outside seems like a complete waste of time. We're singing to an invisible God and praying to an invisible God, spending time together in that space. But she says that it's not productive. It's us worshiping doesn't make God love us any more than he already does. It doesn't make him act any more than he already wants to act. So in that sense, it's a waste of time.
Yeah.
If we're doing that to be productive, we're trying to get something from him. But then on the other side, she says that by entering into this worshipful experience, there's something that is happening inside of us that then somehow qualifies us to do work outside of that worshipful experience.
Yeah.
And so just kind of thinking of this idea of maybe solitude then is seen as a waste of time because it's not productive. It's not about doing something, but it's almost entering into this experience with God that somehow transforms something from the inside out. And so I'm just curious as to what people think about this idea of solitude and of being with God and of not actively trying to produce something in that space.
I think definitely going into those moments, I feel like I want to get something out of it. And when we have alone time with God, there's not necessarily always a big moment or like a takeaway from it. And so when we get into those spots and we're like, I didn't get anything from this, like what's the point of me doing it? We don't look at the long game of like, this is a continual journey with God and not a quick get my fix and then keep going with the day. So I feel like our need for productivity and being efficient definitely affects the way that you can actually rest in God's presence and experience those moments.
So good.
Yeah, I think with that comes a question like, how does one know that they've truly experienced solitude? Is it a feeling? Because sometimes you enter into that space of quiet and silence, and like you said, nothing happens. Or maybe you exit. We talked about the entrance point and the exit point. Sometimes you exit it and you don't feel any better than maybe when you've entered, because it is this process that takes time. So I'm just wondering, like, how do we truly know that we've experienced solitude in that true sense?
Yeah.
I think like a lot of it is like intention, where it's like, I think like when you're like in high school, you just see people every day. It's really easy to have friends because you're like, oh, I see you every day. We're like beside each other in math class. I hang out with this person like 3 hours a week, right? But then it's like you become an adult and then you're like, wait, I actually have to like schedule time with like people who care about me and like hang out with them. And it's like it's a challenge because it's not given to you. It's not like, it doesn't just flow. Sometimes you need to be like, I want to spend time with you, and we need like, not like a controlling thing, but like really being super almost ruthless and disciplined in like, I want to spend time with you, I value you kind of thing. And I think like that's maybe something in solitude where it's like having that intention with God, and it's not about like, oh, like I feel like, it's very dangerous to have your feelings of after your prayer signify how you feel about your prayer, because then you get to this like scary slippery slope of when you're in a low in life, then you're like, oh, like God's not answering my prayers, what does this mean? But it's literally just like you're in a desert and you just like, the only thing to do is to just keep walking, right? Where it's just like, I don't feel like you're answering my prayers, but I need to just keep going because that's the only thing I can do, and I know you're faithful. And it's not a like a feeling choice, it's like a disciplined, like ruthless choice of being like, I'm choosing this right now, right? So it's, I think maybe that's kind of like the solitude where it's like very high intentioned rather than like going off of feelings, because feelings can come and go, but like ruthlessly choosing something, like obviously you may like fail sometimes, but like usually that will stay over like, oh, I'm not feeling it today kind of thing, right?
So good. So good. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I feel like it's what John Mark Comer talked about in The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Like, we're so caught up in the rhythm of the world that we forget to walk by God's rhythm, which is just like a slow pace that, like, it's creation. He worked for 6 days, he rested for 1. And I was reading this other book that was talking about how we don't just Sabbath on that 7th day, but we Sabbath every day because our souls just need that rest.
I think that's such an important point about rhythm. Is God set up the world to work according to a certain rhythm, right? Which, by the way, I would say is a slow rhythm. And I say this all the time, God is slow. And people are like, yeah, that's awesome. And then about 15 seconds later, they go, well, I mean, God seems slow to us, but really God is working in God. I'm like, well, which is it? Is God slow? But we take slow as a negative category, right? And that's a fascinating thing.
Because we want things now, but we don't notice that it's really just preparation for what's to come.
Okay, so think of this, right? So the leaves are falling off the trees right now. And how do we normally frame this? As we talk about the beauty of fall, but we're like, it's beautiful, but what's happening in autumn? Why are the leaves falling?
Transition.
Snow's coming, yeah.
The trees are trying to reach apoptosis.
Regenerate.
Okay. I don't think everybody talks about it that way.
There's like transition.
Transition. But a lot of times people talk about death. They're like, it actually signifies death because the leaves are actually dying, right? But on the other hand, Karel Čapek, actually, the guy who I referenced in the very first talk, the guy who coined the term robot. So this same guy, he writes on gardening. He talks about October as the first spring. Because he says, in October, things begin to grow down. And we don't see this growth. We don't experience it, right? To your point, we don't walk away. It's like the prayer time that we walk away from, that we're like, well, I didn't really sense anything. Or the run, like not all runs do you get a runner's high. Some of them you just like come back and like, oh, it was brutal. I did it, but it was brutal. But in October, things begin to grow down. And in the wintertime, actually, this is when the tree gets stronger because it's growing the roots down. And it's a slow work, it's an unseen work, but it's exactly what's happening now that allows for spring, when everything begins to grow again. I was at a lecture, I'm trying to remember if this is lecture 1 or 2 last week. We saw Willie James Jennings, and Danny was there too, and Nola was there actually, I think, weren't you? No? Maybe you just came for dinner. And he said in one of the lectures, he said, how do we think of the future coming? Like, if somebody could demonstrate it to me, just visually, how does the future come to us? Think spatially. Where, if you could point to the future and then bring it to yourself, where is it? Okay, interesting. I see some pointing.
Forward.
A whole lot of confusion, right? But he would say normally we think of the future as out there and it's coming here, or it's out there and we're moving towards it. And he said this is totally wrong. He said the future is here. He said because everything that we know comes up. Every seed that gets planted goes down, but the future actually is springing up. So the future, in a sense, is below us. And I think that informs how we think about the spiritual life as well, right? We often think of the spiritual life as way out there somewhere that hopefully we can achieve, as opposed to that prayer time, which may feel, and in fact, we talked about Bonhoeffer said this last time. He's like, look, you may not walk away from your time of prayer and solitude feeling like, that was the best thing that ever happened. What a mystical encounter. He said, that might happen. But it's never unproductive. And it's like the seed in the ground. It's like the roots in autumn and winter, which are preparing for the heavy load of spring. So, yeah.
Yeah, it makes me, there's almost a progression even to solitude. It's not something we kind of fence in and try to, and you talked about this last time, this kind of our need for control.
Yeah.
And we don't know what to do in a space where we can't really control what is happening to us. And so I think Eugene Peterson talks about this idea of willful but active passivity. So he says that when we come to prayer, we willfully submit to an activity that has been initiated by God himself.
Yeah.
We're responding to something that he has already opened up the horizon for us to enter into. And so when I think of solitude and kind of this idea of control and how if it's a progression, then you don't really have much control over how long it takes or how the stages of development will be about, but almost this idea of willfully entering into some sort of like a submission to a process that God has already initiated. He's already waiting for us in that space, wanting to, speak over us or wanting to just love us. And so I think even for me, part of the struggle sometimes to not do is that control of, I'm going to do my quiet time and receive something. I'm going to pray, speak to God and it's going to come back. And so we really don't know what to do with that space of not trying to control.
Yeah.
Because none of us are in control of anything, actually.
Yeah.
Anything. Furthermore, God is not in control. Everybody's like,
We're
this is
going
the
there.
last time I'm coming to this event of heresy. God is not in control. We say this all the time. Don't worry, God is in control. God is in control. But control is not the right word for it. Because control assumes a certain pulling of the strings, a certain forceful making something happen. God is not out of control, and I'm drawing Chris Green here now.
Yes.
Theologian. But control is not even the best category to think of God in, I don't think. God is sovereign. And we've misused that word a lot. In fact, to mean control, God controls everything. The problem with the idea of control, right, is that when a child dies, it's like, well, God's in control. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean God makes everything happen? Like, what do we mean by that? No, God is sovereign. God is somehow working out every moment in a redeemable way. But I love that. What are a willful...
active passivity as opposed to inactive passivity, which he says that it translates into slug or laziness. And I wonder if sometimes that's the fear for us in withdrawing to being with God for an extended period of time because, you know, maybe like, oh, this is being lazy. I'm not doing anything. And so I think there is a danger with solitude where it can be an excuse for maybe laziness or like inaction. But he's saying that that active component has to do with awareness, has to do with being fully present in that relational interaction with God in that space.
What does it feel like when you feel like you're fully present somewhere?
I'm just gonna ask, like, what does it like practically look like to be fully present and like in that film? Like, that's a good question. It got me thinking. I'm like, all right, let me think.
And you don't have to think of like prayer.
Just like with
People on a walk, on whatever.
I think it's like for me personally, it's more like you're in harmony with everything else. It's like the best way for me to describe it. Like I go camping a lot, and especially like when I'm camping out on my own and it's just me in the wilderness, like I feel present, I feel content, I feel, closer. That kind of that's the best way for me to describe it.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I feel like it's we say like listen to people and like that'll make you present, but we're like constantly thinking about what we need to say next. And for me, being present is just like actually absorbing what people are saying and not letting the worries of the day get in the way and just like really focusing on one thing, putting your phone away, enjoying it, noticing my surroundings. Like I like the word harmony too. Like you just feel at peace.
Yeah, no striving.
Yeah.
I think of being in tune with reality. And that sounds maybe obvious, but I think it's very easy to be present in a moment but not be attuned to kind of the meaning of the moment.
Yeah.
And so I think, that harmony piece, that listening piece has to do with kind of being able to experience reality as it really is.
Yeah, true reality.
Which then kind of makes me think of time. And you talked about this in our last talk about how solitude is a manner of re-experiencing time and of time being redeemed. Because I think in our culture, time is kind of made a commodity, right? We divide up our hours to be organized, and that's not a bad thing. And of course, we're employed and people pay us for our time. Like it kind of becomes this thing that we control and we can stretch, and we have say over what goes into our time and what doesn't. But then I think of kind of being in the presence of God, who is outside of time. Like how do we experience time in that space?
Yeah. So I mean, if time is, I think of time well, time is a created thing. It's another created being almost. And to go back to your word rhythm from earlier, God works according to a certain rhythm. So can we get in sync with God's time, and are there certain practices that allow us to do that? But you're absolutely right. Time is a commodity. Which is why we like think about the expression "time is money." Like, really, is time money? But if time is money, then how does that shape my imagination for how I live my life day to day? Am I spending my time with my son? Am I able to have a royal waste of time? Right in your as you pointed to Marva Dawn's words. If it doesn't make me money. But the other thing, time, we experience time as burden.
Yeah.
And if you think about how we talk about time, I mean, what are some of the things we say as time as burden? Like, there's only so many hours in the day. Particularly when we're like getting close to exams, midterms or whatever, right? It's like, I don't have enough time. And so suddenly time becomes
Something you can run out of.
Something you can run out of. And then if you think of it as in a larger way, and I always hate making myself seem so old in these events, but like, it is what it is. When you hit my age, and just you hit the switch somewhere along the line. I think for me it might have been when my dad died, where you realize like I actually don't have all the time in the world. I am, midway through my, like for me, midlife crisis does not look like wanting to buy a sports car and like all the stereotypical things. For me, it is, oh my gosh, do I have time to do the PhD? And do I have, and what if I had done this differently? And what if I had have started earlier? And what if I had done this differently with my money? And what if I had done, and you go through all of these weird things because you then, but think about what that does to your life. If I don't, and it goes back to achievement through identity, right? If I don't do all of these things,
who am I?
Right? And it's like life then becomes a race against the clock. I don't know I don't know how many days I have left, and we all think you all think it's forever.
Nope.
Right? But it feels that way and then suddenly, I don't know, like your parents die or your friend dies. This is, by the way, why I think Ash Wednesday, something very few like evangelical churches practice. I didn't practice it growing up, but I think it's a deeply important practice because it's once a year where you are reminded you are going to die. And we spend our whole lives trying to avoid that reality. But what it does is say, it reorients your understanding of time. But solitude does this too. By the way, so I just read this morning. Abraham Heschel is one of my favorite authors. And he says, forgive his language here, because it's very masculine. This is old, okay? The modern man, the modern person, has not only forgotten how to be alone, he finds it even difficult to be with his fellow man. He not only runs away from himself, he runs away from his family. To children, honor your father and mother is an irrational suggestion. The normal relationship is dull. Deviation is where pleasure is found. Then he says this, the modern man does not know how to stand still, how to appreciate a moment, an event for its own sake. When witnessing an important event, and this is written like decades ago, by the way, when witnessing an important event or confronted with a beautiful sight, all he does is take a picture. Perhaps this is what our religious traditions must teach the contemporary man, to stand still and behold, to stand still and hear. And then he, to your question, he says, he's a Jewish scholar, and he had written, Judaism claims that the way to nobility of the soul is the art of sanctifying time. Moral dedications, acts of worship, intellectual pursuits are means in the art of sanctification of time. And so I think what this does, when I'm able to have these moments of real solitude and like something in my soul happens, my life is no longer a race against the clock. And the tree is no longer a commodity that I have to take a picture of, or the sunset. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but like you can just experience the moment for what it is, and that sanctifies time, as he says. It changes how time is no longer money. time is no longer a burden, and my life is no longer judged by the clock. Time has been sanctified, and time is now gift instead of burden.
Wow.
So that's at least part of what I think is going on in those moments. We expand somehow, right?
And it almost stops becoming a means to an end. Like time is always kind of a means to an end, but it almost, in that space with God becomes not a means to an end. He becomes the end in itself. You know, that moment, like you said, we experience it for the sake of experiencing it and not to do something with it beyond that, even though it does impact us in the long run somehow. And it will improve the quality of our lives and inevitably the quality of the kind of work we produce in the world. But it's not trying to grasp for that in order to get to a different end.
Yeah, I guess on a different note, the thing that I struggle with is the aspect of it needing to be like this uninterrupted, like spontaneous 50-minute time. But like, I got work from 8 to 4:15. I have to get up and get ready. When I come home, I'm making dinner, I'm getting ready for the next day, and I like to go to bed early. So it's like, I don't have that time. It has to be scheduled within my day, but then it just doesn't feel as, you know?
Special. It doesn't feel like I'm sanctifying. It feels like I'm punching my 15 minutes.
It's like, hey,
in.
check.
Like, yep, I sat on my yoga mat for 15 minutes. Like, thanks God. Like, I didn't like. It doesn't feel like it should be. You know, like that.
Yeah. Well, so maybe a couple questions on that. What would it look like then for you to shift your understanding of time during the day, and not just? I think the temptation is, and obviously we're talking about solitude, right? So valid point. But is there a way of shifting our understanding of the day? And is there other times when we can have prolonged seasons of, and by prolonged, like even a day or whatever, or an hour on the weekend or whatever, that can reorient how we think of time. Because I said something earlier about, and I knew I was uncomfortable with myself as I was saying it. When I'm like, not like when you're praying, but I actually think the deeper into life with God that we go, the more all of life, we realize that actually all of life is prayer. And that is the sanctifying of time. Right? That when I'm doing some of these mundane things, they can actually be prayer. But maybe it's a posture. If I'm not trying to commodify it again. I kept coming back to that Leanne Payne quote, we either contemplate or we exploit. And right, so this, even the picture can be a means of exploitation. I'm doing this weird thing right now for a course I'm in where I have to keep a tree journal. And so I have to write weekly about the tree in my front yard.
Wow.
And my professor today said, have any of you noticed that you're thinking about, like maybe it's windy and you're thinking about your tree back home and like wondering about it? Like wondering about it when you're not just right with it? And I'm like, I totally have. I'm wondering about like, oh, I'm away. Like, how many leaves have fallen off today?
Just checking my
In a live cam.
Or what's the color? But think about, that's how we think of, like, we don't only think of friends when we're actually only just with them.
That's
If they're real friends, we think about them when we're not with them. So when we can learn how to contemplate even creation around us, then we think of it, it just changes how we think, you know?
Well, that's like where the Jesus prayer comes from, right? Like, I have to study a lot of ancient history, and so I've been focusing on like early Christian asceticism, and like how these people were focused on like loneliness and getting away from distractions and focusing on God. And like it's kind of funny because you would expect them to like come out with like these big books on how to do it, but they come out with like this one prayer that's it's like, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner.
Yeah.
They just keep repeating that over and over and over again, emptying their minds so that they can be fully present with the Lord. And so that it's more than just like, you know, oh, I don't have time to take this out of my day, but it's like developing like a sort of discipline where it's, even if you don't want to, you know, it's a 3-second prayer that you can say that can empty your mind and get you, you know, focused on being present with the Lord. And kind of reminds me of that passage in Matthew talking about like he who knocks. That kind of, you also have to participate in it too. Like it's not just completely passive. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And to your point, Sharon, I think too of, there's this book, some of you have heard of it probably, called Practicing the Presence by Brother Lawrence. And he was this monk from the, 1600s? Something like that. And he...
I would take Sarah's word.
I think so. And his job was to be a cook at this tiny monastery somewhere in Europe, I'm sure. But he kind of kept this journal, and it's become a very central work for kind of spiritual formation and transformation, because he talks about doing these mundane tasks, but somehow feeling closer to God in those times of mundane tasks than even in taking time away to pray. So he kind of, you know, as he's washing the dishes, he's praying and asking God to cleanse him. And again, so it doesn't, I'm not saying that this is what we all have to do, but I think there's something to be said about how solitude almost retransforms and reconfigures our day-to-day life to the point where that distance becomes, that separation isn't almost there, and you can actually maybe experience solitude in your day-to-day activities by being connected to God at all times, you know? But
Oh, totally. And I think of the former Buddhist chaplain at the U of C. He had said something one time that really challenged me about a practice that that he does, and it had something to do with like the first drink that you have during the day, first sip of water, or for me, first sip of coffee. He's like, how do you experience that? Like, do you sit down and it's just, I'm just like getting through my coffee? He said, what's it like to pay attention to your cup of coffee, or to pay attention to your cup of water, to actually spend time? And that was a few years ago. I think of it all the time, and sometimes I do it, and other times I just like, I start there, and then I just grab the phone, and I'm like looking on Instagram. I'm like, why can't I not have a cup of coffee? You know what I mean? And so I think it's, you know, I'm thinking of like, I only have this so much time, but what's it like to sit with a cup of coffee just intentionally and not? It takes discipline. Like, it's hard, actually. It's foolishness that it's hard, but it is hard to sit down and just enjoy whatever, you know, your water or your coffee or your tea or whatever you do in the morning. And so some of these things, I think, can actually help to sanctify time as well. It's again, it's paying attention. It's being in the moment instead of coffee is actually just a means of energizing me. It's actually, well, maybe I could think about the process that, you know, things went through to get that cup of coffee. It's pretty wild, right? But you know.
Yeah, and it kind of comes back to, like, I think this was you who was talking about it, but of solitude not being necessarily the space where we're like all alone, but actually experiencing it throughout the day-to-day. And as you guys are talking, I'm like, oh yeah, that was kind of touched on last week about you can experience solitude when you're with other people, and you can experience it as you're doing other things. And just because you're doing something else doesn't mean you can't pray while you're doing it, or I don't know, experience solitude, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like I have a little bit of like pushback on this idea of like solitude in your day to day, like while you're doing stuff. Because if it's like to sanctify time a little bit more and take you out of that productivity, and you can't even take 5 minutes to just be, I'm like, oh, you know? So for me, it's like really hard to think about solitude in that way. I don't think it can be as rich. I don't think it can be. I don't know.
I guess it
Can it
depends
be?
what you're doing.
Yeah.
It does. But like, to your point, the times that I've had the best solitude have been when I'm like away for like 3 months in the mountains of the Philippines and like just reading my Bible every day, but like that's not practical.
Right.
And it would be ideal if 5 minutes, but like mentally I can't do that for just 5 minutes. I'm running through my day and like, you know what I mean?
That's allowed.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, to go back to the concept of withdrawal, because I think I think it's a healthy pushback.
Yeah.
What does it mean? I've had times during busy work days where I'm like, I need to take a 10-minute walk.
Yeah.
So it's not like, we can sometimes over spiritualize this and be like, what I need to do now is go through the prayer list at the back of my journal. I'm like, no. Like, that's great, right? I'm not saying any of that is bad. What I am saying is that there's a way of being attentive and alone with God, that maybe that walk can help propel us. It brings us back in a different headspace to then be with others more intentionally. That when we are on the job, when we are doing the dishes, when we are whatever. And this happens for me. I don't know how it happens for you. For me, I've had, earlier this week, and I talk about this all the time. It's kind of funny, but it's true actually, where I was like really stressed about something my wife knew, and she goes, "You should probably go for a run." And it's actually, again, it was the thing I didn't want to do. But when I did go on the run, I came back, it changed my whole day. And I wasn't listening to anything, but I was able to get embodied again, and to be alone with God. Even last night I was driving the car and I'm just like, you know what, let me not put on the podcast. I paused the podcast and I'm like, okay, God, I'm just going to get real here for a minute. Kind of frustrated with a few things. I named them and then I just drove for a bit. And, what happens there? I don't know.
But it's interesting because is solitude non-activity? Like we just have to sit in a chair and, contemplate? Or is it entering into a different kind of activity that actually helps us to really connect with God? For example, running, you're still moving your body. There's still motion, activity happening, but somehow your soul in that space and your mind are being connected to one another and to God. And I know I've experienced that on runs as well, where I feel weirdly connected to God, maybe more than if I'm just sitting in one chair and like trying not to move for an hour and forcing myself to not do that. And so I just wonder, is solitude non-activity, or is it entering into a different kind of activity that is not burdensome or demanding, but that helps us to be away and connect with God, if that makes sense? Like, is the problem activity, or is it that
The wrong activity.
Yeah.
Is it just slowing down?
Yeah, it's something, because I would say even a walk is better than a run.
Right, yes.
And I've talked about this with...
I agree.
I feel like a run, I feel like a run would do more for me than a walk sometimes.
Well,
solitude.
but what, more of what would be my question. So for me, and I had this conversation with Mark Buchanan. He's an author here in the city, and he wrote a book called God Walk. And I said to him, I have this thing that happens to me when I run without music. And sometimes people are like literally my daughter, if she can't find her AirPods, she's like, I'm not going to the gym. I'm like, just run with no music. It's like, what kind of freak would run with no music? And I'm like, I'm a weirdo. I can run with ballads playing. I'm like, whatever.
Oh, same.
But I'll say this: I have I have quick thoughts when I run. I have super oh my gosh, I have this idea and this idea. I got to get back and write them down. Blah, blah, Whereas when I walk, I have productive thinking. I have productive. They're both productive, but for me, they're productive in different ways. Where my thoughts are much more slow, and it's actually what's happening inside me seems to go with the pace of how I'm moving.
That's fair.
It's also environment, like where you're doing it, right?
Yeah.
I can't run on a treadmill, but I can go for 20 kilometers on a trail with nothing to listen to, but outside when you're completely alone. It's where you're doing it too. I definitely say, because
Is the discomfort all bad, I guess, is the other question too. Because I think of this with fasting. I'm if I fast, and I don't fast nearly enough, but if I'm okay, I'm going to fast, and then I'm going to feel so close to God and be wow, this is going to be amazing. And actually, I just end up being an irritable human being. No fun to be around. And yet, I think that's part of the purpose, is to realize how dependent I've become on there's this verse in the Bible somewhere where it talks about your belly is your God. And I'm like, right? Oh yeah, that for me, when I fast, I never think about that verse, but when I fast, I think about it all the time. I'm like, oh my goodness, yeah, totally. I want, and when I fast, I'm but I'm going to fast everything but no coffee. I have to have coffee because I'll have too bad of a headache. But it just shows me my the addictions in my life, and that people shall not live by bread alone. And I always remember that. So again, I always want the mystical encounter. Sometimes what I get is cranky, but I'm able to bring that to God, and that is so important. Our restlessness, we can bring that to God, and I do think that it's important. Now when talks about the spiritual life, he said most of us think of it as climbing higher and higher and higher. He says not really that. He said it's more circular. We move in rhythms, and hopefully we're spiraling, closer to God as we go through these circles and cycles of life. And at one point in the circle we're busy, another time we have more time, and then we become busy again or whatever. But how is time redeemed, I guess, in the rhythms of life,
I mean, when we look at the life of Jesus, there are a few instances in the Gospels where he intentionally withdraws. And I would say Jesus did things very intentionally and slowly, I would say, but he was extremely busy. And so I don't think necessarily our problem is busyness. He still was doing work, but he did it in this rhythm somehow. And I think of him, if Jesus, one of the busiest, man in the world, he took time to pray and to go and leave the crowd to be with a Father and connect. That just, there's no excuse for us. So it's maybe not a matter of having time or not, because again, it's not something we possess. If we say I have the time or I don't have the time, maybe it's that matter of priority and how do we prioritize solitude in the context of busyness. What does solitude look like for student life, for being a nurse, or being a father and a chaplain, and how does solitude become a rhythm and not something we, like a vacation that we go to temporarily once a year and then, oh, we're fixed up, now we can resume back regular life. But how does this actually become incorporated into our life?
Yeah.
Are we willing to like do what Jesus did and stay up all night to pray and actually get close? Like, no, I don't know. Honestly, it's like, am I willing to be like live out, like be more like Jesus? And it's like, that's a big question. It's a big ask.
But I think we start where we are too, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is part of the trick of the spiritual journey. Like, I'll say two things. One is we can forever make excuses of like, but on the other hand, we're called to be people, not angels. Most of us have a spirituality for angels, and we're trying to achieve it, and God never intended it. We're people. And living in this world in a particular way. And so I think, goodness, I have 10 minutes. But God, can you use 10 minutes? I'd be curious, just hearing from different people, like, when is it that you've been alone or had particular practices where you felt time get sanctified?
Maybe like on my night shifts is like when I have the most time to like actually be with the kids. And then so like I'll pick one up and just like snuggle and like pray with them. And I feel like that's like time like when you can make intention like on my shift actually.
Wow.
But
That's
like,
beautiful.
Yeah, on daily life. I don't know.
That's daily life.
I guess, yeah.
I think that's beautiful. Yeah, who else?
Share
Yeah.
I can be with a lot of people around me, have many friends, and feel lonely at the same time. I feel lonely when I'm away from God's presence. You are not alone if you have Jesus and His Holy Spirit. I can be alone, but I will not feel alone. Matthew 28, verse 20 says, Jesus says, I am with you always, even until the end of the world. And John 14, verse 16 to 20, Jesus as well says, and I will ask the Father, and He will give you another helper to be with you forever, the Spirit of the truth. He lives with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you.
Beautiful. Thank you for taking the time to write that down too. That means so much to us.
Thank you.
It's beautiful reminder that we're not doing this by ourselves. The Father sent a helper, and so our solitude is not fully alone. Anyone else? When are times when you've been alone that you felt like, man, I felt time redeemed there, time sanctified?
For me personally, like, I used to have this really good habit way back where I'd actually like wake up at like 4 a.m. and just read my Bible. And, like, maybe the first 15 minutes I'll have my coffee just to really wake up, I guess, and then that's when I started reading my Bible, and then that's really when I felt, I guess, in solitude and really just focused. And there are times where like I'd be reading scripture and then I'd just like tear up sometimes because I actually felt like He was like speaking to me there.
Wow.
And like I don't know that. I know it's a weird time and like it's very intense, but like it was just everyone's asleep, no one's texting you, no one's trying to call you or anything. It's just you and just God and the Bible, right? Like I put my phone somewhere else, like I'm not looking at my phone at all. And it kept me like, I had a really good rhythm. and I was really disciplined because like I'd have to sleep the night before like really early because like if I'm gonna wake up at 4 a.m. I gotta get my sleep too, right? So in that way, like I was very disciplined, and then like if I start my day like reading my Bible, kind of like throughout the day, I'm like always thinking about the scripture that I read, so I'm always like in his, I guess in his presence. I'd always be like mindful of, okay, this is what I read this morning, and then and it'll just set my day up really nice too. Like I'm more focused, I'm more like driven to, more motivated, I guess, to do whatever I need to do and fulfill all my responsibilities during that day. So I kind of like regressed to some bad habits. Like right now, probably like I'll wake up at like 6, maybe 6 a.m.
Always 6.
What a slacker.
I wish I could come back to like 4 a.m. and actually, because like that was a really good rhythm for me. Like I got so many things done. Like I get my work done, I get my readings done and everything. Meal prep and everything. It was a good rhythm. But now I need to get back to it though.
Wow.
Yeah.
Anybody else less intense? That's great, bro.
For me, like the sense of harmony, and even working at night, like I used to work at a lumber mill back home, and so I worked what's called the graveyard shift, so 12 a.m. to 7 a.m. And the mill would like shut down at around 1, and it would just like this thing where you had to put like earplugs on earplugs to just like walk in during the day. It's completely silent at night, and you're doing manual labor, hard labor, but there's nobody around you. You're just like, you're in this rhythm. You're doing, I think it's a combination of hard work and kind of silence where you're in a repetitive motion where you can really get into your own thoughts, and that's where I've had like the best contemplative moments and the best like conversations with God for sure. Like anything manual labor where it's not required to think, that's when I think the best.
Beautiful. So everybody, 1 a.m., 4 a.m.
You're getting
That's where we're
fun.
at so far. No, who else? That's beautiful.
I think for me, something recently that I've been kind of astonished by is public transit. But I don't know, like it's just, you don't drive, you're like not in control of when you get there, you're just gonna get there. And you know, there could be like 10 stops, there could be 30, and you're gonna still get there. And so it's just like, and you're kind of just sitting there alone, or you're not. But like, it's still like, feels like a kind of like just a peaceful time when I'm not in control of one thing for, you know, for some 30 minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
Amen.
That's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take the bus home then.
What was the question?
Just like when you, moments of solitude where when you felt time sanctified.
Oh, okay. I think for me, it's definitely anytime I'm outdoors and I don't have my phone on me. So it's kind of rare because I have times I need to be places, but the moments where I'm like, okay, I have a day, I'm just gonna go on a walk or a hike or sit out in my backyard, lay on a blanket, just sit and not have to worry about the time. That's when I hear God the best and feel like, I'm not controlled by time.
Beautiful.
Definitely find very similar with outdoors. And I feel like for me it almost helps too if I have like a specific place, because then my mind gets into that rhythm of like, okay, when I go there, we're slowing down. Like there's this duck pond just off campus, and it was so nice, especially over the spring and the summer. I used to go there, it was like originally once a week, and then I started going like every day. Usually I'd bring my book like planning to read, but then I would end up just sitting, staring at the ducks in the water, and it was just honestly one of the nicest parts of the week.
Beautiful. Love that.
When I was in university, way back, I used to work at TNT, and
You worked at TNT?
I worked at TNT.
No way.
All those language skills, from
Yeah, that's
French, English, Chinese. But when I was working there, I used to get the either graveyard shifts or I would have to walk up at the very end. There you go.
One of us.
And after, like at around like whenever we had to leave. Sometimes it would be like 9 o'clock, other times it would be like 5 o'clock, and then I have to go back home. But I lived pretty much like 45 minutes away just by walking, so I would take that trail just from Harvest Hills down to Bennington Boulevard. And it was on those journeys I think I encountered God the most while walking. Like maybe going through an underpass, and it echoes when cars are going by. And so you start singing, like, hey, I can hear my voice, this is great. Like, and then if you just belch, it just like resonates.
Oh, wow.
Exactly, I've done that. And it's probably one of those things where I'm supposed to go back home, but on this walk, I will enjoy this walk. Yeah. I will take this walk, and I'm going to have a good time on this walk, and I'm going to breathe in the pollen that's coming in from like the. I don't have any allergies, but for those who have allergies, sorry, but I'm going to breathe in like the CO2 that's being emitted at night. And somehow that's going to be that transformed my life. Like, wow, this place is fresh. This is new. This is there's something glorious, like sanctifying, as we said. In other words, it's like a way to set up a resistance against the commodification of my time. Like people will say, "Oh, I'll give you a ride," or "I can take you home," or whatever. I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to take the time to enjoy God on this walk, and I would call this almost like communion with God. Or if I were looking at the moon, I'm like, wow, look at that, like that moon, and then there's a cloud there. Somehow, like that reminds me of like this ever-flowing river, or I guess in Chinese we call it the Tao. It's not scary, but that whole rhythm, like that communion with God in that journey. I'm not walking. That was kind of how I like stuck it to like TT.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I had a similar thing. Like 2 weeks ago, I stayed up all night just studying for my astronomy midterm. If you know me, you know that happens quite often. But one of the things I was learning is that in a galaxy there's 100 billion stars, and there's about 100 billion galaxies. And like it was 6 a.m, it was pitch black. I just stood outside waiting for the bus, and I look up and I see Orion's belt, and I'm like, God made that. God made 1 septillion stars, and He made me, and it was just like, okay, it's all worth it that I stayed up all night because I get this one moment with God.
Wow, that's amazing. Notice the themes though, like it really is, and come back to your point, times where we are by ourselves, whether or like with a baby too, right? I mean, that's such a beautiful thing. But you'll hear mothers sometimes talk about that in rocking a child in the middle of the night. But like time, you're not sleeping and it's 3 a.m, but time somehow is sanctified there. I've had the same thing, Daniel, where, walking and people are like, oh, I'll give you a ride. I'm like, oh, you're kind of like, I don't really want to ride. I want to walk. Story from a year ago, so not Thanksgiving a few weeks ago, but the year prior, we had like celebrated, I think the day before Thanksgiving, had a big thing. And so like everybody was just home and like crabby, to be honest. And it's just like, oh man, the day is ending. And I was just thinking like, wow, great Thanksgiving. Like yesterday was nice, we'll hold on to that. And my dog was barking and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to take this dog out. And it was super late. Well, not super late, but like 9 or 10, right? But it was cold last year, so it felt late. And so I was walking and I remember looking like, no way, that can't be the Northern Lights. Because I'd never seen the Northern Lights before. Right, so I'd been walking forever with the dog. He's a big dog, so I take him on long walks. And then I hit one point and I'm like, all of a sudden the lights started shifting and I'm like, no way. So I went back. I got my daughter. I'm like, you have to like get in the car. She's like, what are we doing? I'm like, I'm not telling you. Just get in the car. So she gets in the car, and I park up to like the end of where I walked. I'm like, hey, walk around the corner. She walks. She's like, oh my gosh, are those the Northern Lights? I'm like, yeah. So then I go get the whole family, and we are standing outside, and like it wasn't just a little bit of movement. We went like out in the dark where it was really dark, and we were literally like screaming our heads off in the middle of nowhere, all of us, like, oh my gosh, what is happening? And we were losing our minds, and it like changed our whole day, right? But that happened. I often think I would have missed it if I hadn't walked the dog that night and gotten out by myself. So I think place is important, time is important, paying attention is important, and grace is important too. That because that's the other thing that actually keeps us. It presses us back to the burden, right? Of like, oh, now I really wasted the day, and it's like, and wasted it because I had to work hard and I couldn't pause, and now we're going to beat ourselves up for the next 2 weeks, right? So anyway, any final thoughts?
Well, even it's interesting kind of in hearing everyone's experience of solitude, which is really encouraging and shows us that it is possible to enter into that space. Is kind of even you talking about and you, Tina, too, looking at the stars, of this idea of wonder. And I think in our culture, that's a foreign kind of concept to us. Like, when was the last time we were in awe of something or in wonder of something? And God is so worthy to be in wonder of, but I just think of solitude also as this call back to the wonder of who God is. And obviously that comes through, like you said, paying attention and being present to the moment. But solitude doesn't have to be this impossible task. It's not a task either, because then it just becomes a burden, like you said. But it can be possible to enter into kind of in this day-to-day rhythm.
Yeah.
And leads us to that place of wonder and worship, I think, which is that royal waste of time that we're talking about, that makes our souls come alive, and that's that expansion. And so, yeah.
Awesome.